So I want to welcome everyone to tonight's program. This is very, very exciting that we get a chance to speak with and hear and discuss some of the thoughts that three people had when they wrote their article for a new book, Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. I'm looking out at the audience, and I think everyone here is pretty familiar with the impact that sanctions have had on developing countries, on socialist countries, really on any country that has tried to stand up to US or to rise up against US imperialism. And we see it very clearly. You'll see it in all of the talks tonight, and we're touching upon hopefully some really key areas of the world. And tonight we have three writers. We have Soo-Hin Lee. Soo-Hin Lee, who is a founder of the China-US Activist Solidarity Project, a co-editor and contributor of Capitalism on a Ventilator, which we have copies of over there, the impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, and of course, a writer and one of the people who really put together this new sanctions book, which we are having a book launch about today. And Soo-Hin can talk a little more about some of the different things that he has been involved in, the immigration coalitions and many of the other things. And we have Ann Garrison, who is, she was a contributing editor to the Black Agenda Report and a contributor to the Gray One and other publications. Gray Zone. Oh, I must have done that. Gray Zone and other publications. She just returned from 3 months, almost 2.5 months.
She returned in June.
Okay, from Ethiopia, where she wrote extensively about what's going on there, and we'll hear a little bit about that tonight. She's also a Pacifica reporter and host, and she spent 2.5 months in Ethiopia and Eritrea to report on the Ethiopian Civil War that began. We also have David Paul, and David is a member of the Task Force on the Americas, the Cuba Saving Lives campaign, and the Sanctions Kill Coalition. And David helped write a report on sanctions. I think we have it over there. It's one of the reports that you wrote. And he is also one of the brave activists who helped defend the Venezuela embassy when it was, in Washington, D.C. Went on trial, got arrested, went on trial, unfortunately, is here with us today. Go ahead, David.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I just wanted to first clarify, I co-authored our special report on sanctions, which is referenced, and there's a summary of it in the book,
Yes.
but I didn't author any other part of the book. And thanks for doing this. I wanted to just highlight some general things and takeaways from the book. I won't get really specific about any particular area, and some of this may be kind of obvious to others, but there's still points that kind of come out in looking at the book. And I think the book is a really good tool to raise the consciousness and awareness about that sanctions actually exist and what they are. I think it's a really good tool for activists to educate other people and make visible basically the crimes of the US government, which sanctions are. I'm using the word sanctions, it's briefer, but it really, I always try to use the actual term as unilateral coercive measures, because sanctions implies that it's some legal framework to punish somebody for wrongdoing, and that's the opposite of what it is. The sanctions themselves are a crime. And so excuse me if I refer to sanctions sometimes instead of coercive measures. But it's been a general policy of the United States government for years, a policy of coercion and domination, not cooperation among nations. It's based in, it's part of a long history of violence and plunder of other nations just to secure wealth for a few corrupt elites. That's been the history for actually hundreds of years. And it's reflected in sort of ideology and mindset of manifest destiny, the full spectrum dominance, which is a general plan of the State Department to dominate the world. And now what it's kind of turned into is sort of a global Monroe Doctrine, that every part of the world should be under US dominance. The unilateral coercive measures are really an act of war. They're illegal, they are against international law, they violate the sovereignty of nations, which is a basic tenet of the United Nations, which we have signed, and extreme harm causing deaths of thousands of people throughout the world. It's a form of economic terrorism against any country that defies this U.S. agenda. And it's any country that develops an independent path or an independent way of structuring their economy and their society that's not favorable to U.S. business climate or international corporations. Regime change is an important tool, goal of these coercive measures, causing a lot of suffering in countries so that they eventually give up and change their own government. It's what they've been trying to do to Cuba for 60 years. There's actually very detailed statements decades ago. That's exactly what they want to do, is create desperation and hunger so that the people change their own government. And if they can't do that, they will destabilize the economy such that it sends a message to the rest of the world: this is what you're going to get if you try to defy our agenda. The threats of sanctions go beyond just the targeted sanctions against certain countries. They're against other countries that aren't sanctioned, but there's the threat that if you trade with these targeted countries or you have relations that we disagree with, you're going to be under sanctions. So there's a chilling effect that many countries, their reaction to that and fear of those sanctions prevent them trading and helping countries under sanctions. And especially if a country wants to develop a socialist project of really using their resources to help their own people, that's a specific target. And our government is, well, I think afraid that our people in the population in this country would see a poor country providing services that we don't get in our country. That's a bad example. And also maybe making the connections at the same financial and bank interests that plunder economies in other parts of the world. They're also doing it in our country, in poor communities in our country. So it's the threat of a good example is something that they're afraid of. And there's I'm paraphrasing badly, but a quote by Elliot Abrams, who was the special envoy of Trump to Venezuela, saying, "We go all over the world trying to show that socialism doesn't work, and we can't let Venezuela be an exception." So they really trying to make them fail when they claim that they fail on their own, which is a lie. And it's amazing to me how they get away with, for example, you pick many countries, but Venezuela is something you know more about. They will block importation of vital goods. They will steal billions of dollars from their banks. They will deny food and medicine to millions of people and steal their main industry, which provides all the assets that they need for salaries to maintain jobs and infrastructure, and then say, look at this country, as they have doing a terrible job of managing their economy, and with no context of what our government's role in. And sanctions take on many forms, and all these things are illustrated in the book in many different ways: financial, commercial, in terms of trade, economic sanctions. And they all really affect and devastate the most vulnerable people in the population. All countries depend on trade of different sorts: food, vital goods, and especially medicines and food. And denying those things to people, and specifically Venezuela and Cuba, when you deny fuel, you deny medicines, you deny food, you block trade for those items with other countries, you cause deaths. And there's been tens and thousands of deaths caused by our blocking those basic items for their population. There are exemptions to these sanctions, technically on paper, but they don't work because they cause much delays. You have to have special licenses. They cost, and it doesn't help. One example of a sort of diplomatic piracy, and it's part of the sanctions, is the case of Alex Saab, a diplomat of Venezuela, who was kidnapped and has been tortured and kept in prison for 2 years, now on trial in Miami, for simply trying to acquire food and medicine for Venezuela. And they've also piracy on the high seas. They have stolen ships bringing oil and parts for their infrastructure in the Caribbean, and took them to Miami and gave them to the opposition leader, and that piracy of a different sort. And Biden, I don't know if under pressure or whatever, last year said he was going to do a review of sanctions to see if it affected, his reason was to see if it affected a control of COVID. And everyone was anxiously waiting for the review to come out. And when he came out, he said, well, he's troubled that these countries under sanctions are getting around the sanctions. We've got to double down and strengthen our sanctions. It didn't even mention COVID. It was just such a farce. And the one thing that maintains this policy, helps maintain the policy, is one of the greatest tools of our government is propaganda. That the media, most people know very little that the sanctions even exist. It's hardly ever mentioned. I think one of our authors in the book mentioned he could not find one reference to it in the New York Times. People are unaware of it. They are unaware that the United Nations Human Rights Council has done incredible reports saying the tens of thousands of deaths caused by the sanctions. People don't know about that. They're also counting on this myth that the United States operates in the world in a benevolent way, that we are promoting human rights and democracy. At the same time, we're denying food and medicine to children, actually causing deaths of children waiting on cancer treatments, but we've frozen the payment for those treatments. It's just incredible. They also promote this idea that rules-based order, it's their framework for how the world nation should operate. Rules-based order as we break every treaty and every international law at the same time. They also depend on this sort of historical amnesia about all the invasions and violence that the United States has committed around the world. People still have this myth that, well, we're trying to do good. As the book highlights, the goal is hegemony, dominance of the world, and currently in this current time, trying to isolate Europe and the global south from Russia and China. It's basically continuing the Cold War, which never really ended, and they're trying to double down on that. It's backfiring somewhat, as a number of people in the book show, that it's causing a lot of suffering in the global south, who depends on trade and imports, and also causing wrecking the economy in Europe. But like the climate change, the pandemic, the struggle against this kind of policy and empire in general requires unity. And it's what we're seeing in Latin America and Africa, where countries are coming together to find other alternative financial systems, other ways to trade with each other and not depend and avoid this coercion by the United States. And to change this policy, we need to educate people about the crimes that these unilateral coercive measures are, show solidarity with the countries that are under sanctions, raise their voices, provide ways that, as this book does, because you have testimonies from people from other countries, learn from these countries how they're resisting. And I recommend the book. I think the book is a good answer for those tasks that all of us face, and it'll be a good tool for everybody. So I hope people eventually look at it and read it. That's all.
Thank you. Soo-Hin Lee.
Well, what I wrote on the book is specific about the CHIPS Act, how U.S. has been using sanctions against China's high-tech industry. Number two thing is slightly not comfortable. Number one, because it's get into all these stereotypes that all Asians are mathematically good and very smart and all these kind of things. I'm not that smart, but number two is the CHIPS Act name is so strange because the first time when I hear the CHIPS Act, chips, I thought must be something. Is that something to do with the 1970s hit TV show, The Chips?
Yeah, there was something,
Mr.
yes,
Chips?
that was,
California Highway Patrol.
yes, it was California, it was a cop show.
Yes, and so whoever is thinking about this kind of like alphabet soup sanctions or act, they must be somehow that they're thinking all this kind of ill-fated ideology every day. Otherwise, they cannot think. A sanction, B sanction, D sanction, E sanctions. We don't know what they're going to do tomorrow, and keep flip-flopping all the time. So this is not just only an industry, not only an ideology, not just only a Cold War, but also racism, because it's assumption. You send a sanction, just like I went back to 1960s when U.S. I would say directly said invade Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and also the Desert Storm, the so-called Desert Storm, invade Iraq and destroy Iraq. Its assumption is they are inhuman. We can just to destroy them just for the saving the humanity, just like I say, burning the village to state one kind of racist ideology. So sanction is more deep into some kind of like a liberal-minded and then make love no war kind of people that sounds like this is like a cosmetic, like a fashionable statement that we don't actually need to shoot someone, but we can make the other side will be down to the knee, and then we can take care of the business. But in fact, that's not true. Many people die, many people affect. Just like the speaker here and on the webinar said, sanctions do kills. Sanctions do kills many people, ruin people's life. But different in China, also Russia. When U.S. and Western countries sanction, most of the country, 40 countries, overwhelming majority are the most poorest country in the world. Now more African countries have been sanctioned, but China plus Russia, they both are not poor country. They are not small country. They are powerful country. They have enough natural resources, scientific technology, economic means, military power. So simply you're doing a military sanction, economic sanction, it's not going to work. China has been sanctioned by Western power, People's Republic of China specifically, since 1949. Since after especially the Korean War. Throughout the time, they've been sanctioned more or less and more. There's no difference. Even when somebody said a golden period of like a honeymoon period of a China-US relationship between 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's still a certain kind of sanctions. It's just less, more or whatever, never drop.
Right.
So, why CHIPS Act? Is assumption, the two things. I want to be short and because of other speakers, so I make it 5. Then if other people want to ask questions, I can answer later. Number 1, it's because U.S. is losing the ground. U.S. cannot compete with the industrial power and scientific technology. China is catching up, and although it's not necessary every area China can catch up yet, but U.S. is always fear. What we're saying that when I'm boss, I always fear about the second command. The second command, they don't want someone that eventually will be strong and powerful that will overtake the boss. That's always is the idea. Although this is almost like a zero-sum ideology, zero-sum conflict, right? Zero-sum struggle ideology, but that's what U.S. always feared, that someone can catch up. That what happened 30 years ago when Japan seems close to catching up U.S. and then U.S. got freaked out and then done all this sanction and all this economic war with Japan. That what did on the car and the semiconductors and other industries and destroy Japan's economy. So they just want to repeat the same thing again in China. But doesn't seem working right now. The second reason is very important. Is more than other than that. Is the Chinese technology not necessarily 100% or overwhelmingly more advanced than the U.S., But most important thing is a different standard. China developed their own standard, US developed their own standard. Edward Snowden told us every electronic device has their own backdoor. That's how they can get in and then spy on all your conversation, record photos, and etc. Or using the US social networking systems, start from Twitter, YouTube, and Google, etc., Facebook, to launch a color revolution. China do have their own social networking site from TikTok to the WeChat to Huawei. That's all this thing is made in China, Chinese technology, Chinese standard. US does not know how to break in to spy on other people. That's the reason. If Chinese technology, especially Huawei, can rule the world, then US cannot, just like what used to be like a peeping Tom of the world, they can sneak in on everyone else and control the mind of anyone else to start a color revolution as easy as they want. So that's the reason they against Huawei, also against TikTok. Number 3, I want to be sure that simply enough that is a racism. I know it sounds very boring and that will make people sleepy, but that is a racism. Racist ideology. Why? Because there is an idea that Western European white people think that any other nation, any other people are not qualified to have advanced technology. Right. That is the ideology behind the sanction against China. The assumption is Chinese technology will be one day take over US, and US need to be listen to China. That is a very simple Chinese, simple racist ideology. That's why some people freak out and want to run the sanctions. So I want to make sure that makes that everything simple. If more people want to know more details, I can talk when Q&A. People can ask me questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And our final speaker before the discussion is going to be Ann Garrison, talking about the impact of sanctions on Africa, and particularly given her recent visit to Ethiopia and Eritrea. Go ahead.
Thank you.
And do you want the microphone?
Yeah, I've got the microphone.
Oh, good.
Why don't you show that image that I just sent you?
Okay.
It's the last thought.
Oh, the last
It might have been my best thought. That one right there.
This one?
That one, yeah. Okay. This is a rally in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, that happened several months ago, just before Ethiopia was victorious in the Ethiopian Civil War. And there was a big rally for Ethiopian sovereignty all across the country, and this is in Addis Ababa. There were also signs that said, respect our sovereignty. So most Americans don't know that there's been a war going on in Ethiopia, a catastrophic war for the last 2 years. But Ethiopians know that the U.S. is responsible for it. I often say, this is not a democracy because none of us vote for anything that the U.S. does overseas. Most people have no idea, but they know. I met people in IDP camps who said, I don't ever want to hear about anything American, ever again. And I met people in IDP camps who knew about the sanctions and asked, why are you doing this to us? Okay, so my essay in the book is Sanctioning the Horn of Africa. I wrote it with International Criminal Defense Attorney John Philpott. It's specifically about sanctions on Ethiopia and its neighbor Eritrea, but I'm going to say a few words about Somalia as well at the end. The context is this devastating 2-year civil war, which is also a U.S. proxy war in Ethiopia. It's widely agreed that the casualties have been in the hundreds of thousands, far greater than those in Ukraine, and the International Displacement Monitoring Center says that in 2021, Ethiopia had the world's highest number of IDPs, that's internally displaced persons, who've been displaced by conflict. The situation on the ground there has changed since the book went to print, but nothing about the sanctions, nothing that John and I wrote about the sanctions has changed. The first set of sanctions remain in place, and more are still pending. A peace agreement was signed in Pretoria on November 4th, and a peace implementation agreement was signed in Nairobi on November 12th, but it's not clear that the peace is going to hold. It's fragile. It's not clear that the U.S. will accept it, despite how much Ethiopians have suffered. President Biden has not lifted the sanctions, and he's threatening more. Plus, there are sanctions bills, 2 sanctions bills in Congress, House Resolution 6600, the Ethiopia Stabilization, Peace, and Democracy Act, and Senate Bill 3199, the Ethiopia Peace and Stabilization Act of 2022. Both are, of course, the exact opposite of what they claim to be. Now, Judy, could you show the first of the 2 maps I sent you?
Sure.
Okay, this is Ethiopia. This is Ethiopia on a global map, or rather, it's the Horn of Africa. Okay, just so we know what we're talking about. Now the next one. Okay, so this is Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia. Now, some people disagree about what is the Horn of Africa. Some say it also includes Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, but these are the principal nations in the Horn proper: Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Oh, Somaliland is on here on the map because it's disputed. There's a secessionist movement in Somaliland, but for now, this is Somalia. Okay, so just so we know what we're talking about. There are immense resources in the Horn, and the adjacent waterways make it very geostrategic. Oh, I forgot to mention Djibouti. This is Djibouti, this tiny little country here. Djibouti is a country of 1 million people, and there are, let me see, get my list. There are military bases in Djibouti from France, Italy, Japan, China, Saudi Arabia, and the US, and all their navies are out here in the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. 10% of the world's trade, including 10% of its oil, goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits here, through the Red Sea, and 40% of the world's oil passes through out here, through the Straits of Hormuz. So that's part of the reason why it is so geostrategic, but as Glenn Ford said, the late great Glenn Ford said at one of the Eritrean festivals back in 2014, any place, any country, any part of the world that raises an independent head becomes geostrategic. And I think it was the 90s, wasn't it, that the US had to knock over the socialist government of Grenada. Tiny island way out.
It was the mid-80s.
Was it mid-80s? Okay, thank you.
83.
83. Oh, thank you. Okay, way out on the western edge of the Caribbean. Its principal export is nutmeg. It's the nutmeg capital of the world. But Grenada's socialist government could not live because it challenged the U.S. empire. Somalia has immense untapped oil and gas resources, including the largest untapped coastal oil and gas resources here. Eritrea sits on the Arabian-Nubian Shield, which is a vast reserve of industrial critical minerals. Ethiopia has vast fertile farmland and huge hydropower resources, including the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Despite the war, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam came online in February 2022. And the dam could provide electricity to all of Ethiopia, and it has signed contracts to sell electricity downstream into the Rift Valley and to Kenya and Somalia. and I'm sure it will to Eritrea as well. Chinese concerns had contracts to build the electricity delivery infrastructure, and this has been held up because of the war. I was in part of the country where I was visiting some of these IDP camps and traveled over roads that were partially paved because there had been Chinese concerns there paving the roads. And I saw a camp where they had been encamped, and they had picked up and left because of the war. And you could see how important this was. Once you had to ride over, I had to ride over these rock and gravel roads, really tough, really slow, really tough. And the paved roads were a huge relief. So that's just an indicator that and the pause in the building of the electricity delivery structure are parts of what happened because of the war. Now, let's see, in 2018, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power. He negotiated peace with peace with Eritrea, that's Ethiopia's neighbor, ending a long-standing, hugely costly war waged by the TPLF when they were in power. For that, he won the Nobel Prize. And Eritreans filled the streets to welcome him when he came to Eritrea. Within months of negotiating the peace, Abiy also negotiated the tripartite agreement, a regional agreement for cultural, trade, and security cooperation between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. Can you shows this picture? That one. Okay, that is Farmajo, Abdullahi Mohammed Abdullahi, who is Farmajo for short. He was at the time the president of Somalia. The U.S. has managed to knock him out for now, but he's very, very popular, and so I don't think we've seen the last of him. This is President Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, and this is the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. They signed the tripartite agreement, and there was a huge feeling of optimism throughout the region there for a while, before the war started, backed by the U.S. in November 2020. The tripartite agreement was more peace and independence and potential than the U.S. was willing to tolerate in the Horn of Africa. So the TPLF, that was a longtime U.S. client, attacked Ethiopia's Northern Regional Army Base in November 2020, starting this devastating 2-year war. The U.S. was represented. Its proxy was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, otherwise known as the TPLF, which had ruled Ethiopia with U.S. backing for 27 years from 1991 to 2018. It was then overthrown by popular uprisings, which brought Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to power. While in power, the TPLF divided the country into ethnically defined states and forced citizens to carry identity cards specifying their ethnicity, even if they were of mixed heritage. My host, when I was in Addis Ababa, told me that when he went to get his ID card, he told them, my grandfather was Jewish, my grandmother was Amhara, my father was Somali, etc. I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as an Ethiopian citizen. They said, no, you have to be something, so they stabbed Somali on his identity card. And this caused a huge storm of ethnic politics that were finally expressed in the war. Could you show us the map? The map of Tigray. Yeah, that one. Just that one. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. This is Ethiopia before the war. You see, the only state that is ethnically identified up there is Tigray. So now, there's a map. There's a map of. Did I say before? That was before. I got my words mixed up. That one.
Which one?
Okay, now this is the ethnically defined Ethiopia. You got Tigray, Amhara, Afar, Oromia. Some of these some of these, in Somalia, well, not Somalia, there's, Somalia. Some of these, like these three smaller states, are so ethnically mixed that there's no way to identify them ethnically. But this created immense ethnic competition and animosities. That you had people, say, people who are Amhara who had lived in this region in Oromia for many years, but suddenly they didn't have the same rights that Oromo in that region had. Also, in this map, you see Tigray is larger than it was in the earlier one. The TPLF annexed this land, which had been occupied by Amhara for many, many years, and the contest over that part, what they call Western Tigray and what Amhara call Walkite, that has to be resolved for there to be peace. But to show you how much the U.S. was involved and intervening in this, at the outset of the war, the UN ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, came out and said, "Don't you dare redraw any of your internal boundaries." So that was an indicator of how much they were behind the TPLF. Like I said, the ethnic demarcation of these regional boundaries and the identity cards created a storm of ethnic politics, and this was in a nation that already needed to overcome the wounds from a history of conquest and counter-conquest going back to the ancient world. And this storm of ethnic politics was ultimately expressed in the war. The hashtag Tigray genocide appeared within 24 hours of the TPLF's first attack on the Ethiopian army in November 2020. Then ensuing atrocity reports, including those of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, portrayed the Tegaru, the people of Tigray, as the victims of the war. Various Congress people, including Ilhan Omar, started urging the State Department to conclude that genocide and that there was a Tigray genocide underway. Now, and I think we all know that genocide and mass atrocities have superseded the war on terror as an excuse for U.S. aggression. That was obvious recently in Libya and Syria, but it was also the excuse way back in the 90s during the NATO bombing and destruction of Yugoslavia. Now, of course, it couldn't be more preposterous for a nation that's invaded, bombed, and sanctioned more countries than any of us could count here tonight, to claim that its foreign policy is based on stopping genocide and mass atrocities, but that's the way it is right now. I went to Ethiopia in part to witness and report on the devastation that the TPLF army caused in this region, Amhara, and this one here, Afar. All the press was reporting was about victims in Tigray because they were the chosen, they were the worthy victims, they were the victims of genocide that the U.S. was going to champion and use as an excuse for interfering. And what I saw there was horrible. It was horrible. IDP camps all up and down the sides of the major roads. People needing food, water, medicine, people who'd lost everything, mothers who'd run for days. I talked to one who had lost a child along the way and was close to losing another child in Afar region. And this was barely reported. Once it got really bad, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch felt obliged to mention it, but the suffering in Tigray was always prioritized. The TPLF fired rockets into Eritrea at the same time that they started the war in northern Ethiopia, drew Eritrea into the war, and the U.S. foreign policy establishment hates Eritrea because it has an egalitarian political system, It's one of 2 African nations refusing to collaborate with AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command. It's avoided World Bank and IMF debt strangulation, and it demands a fair price for its natural resources. It's unprecedented in Africa. If you read anything good about Eritrea in the past 3 years or so, I probably wrote it. I went there and I loved it. So now I'll try to shorthand the specifics of the sanctions, which are detailed in the book. In September 2021, President Biden issued Executive Order 14046, invoking the National Emergencies Act and claiming that conflict in Ethiopia, way out here on the eastern edge of Africa, threatens U.S. national security. Well, like Grenada, you know. In November 2021, he imposed sanctions on Eritrea, which include exclusion from the SWIFT system, which enables banks to rapidly execute international financial transactions. Eritrea is now one of 4 countries excluded from using the SWIFT system. The other 3 are Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Those sanctions remain in place, and the consequences of being unable to use the SWIFT system are cumulative, as are the consequences of any sanctions. States, corporations, and commercial transit companies become afraid to deal with a sanctioned country for fear of falling afoul of U.S. sanctions. And sanctions bills often include, as David said, secondary sanctions, sanctions on countries that are willing to trade with a sanctioned country. At one point, due to past sanctions, sanctions that were in place from 2009 to 2018, UNICEF had to fly vaccines into Eritrea because transit companies were afraid to deliver them. In January 2022, Biden canceled Ethiopia's preferential trade status under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which had allowed manufacturers in Ethiopia to import goods into the U.S. tariff-free, making it a desirable manufacturing destination. This cost a lot of poor Ethiopians their jobs. In many cases, a lot of women lost the first job they'd had in the money economy, and it limited Ethiopia's ability to accumulate the foreign cash reserves that it needs for international trade. Biden could impose more sanctions whenever he wants. If you saw the list of what the president could do just by declaring a national emergency, you'd be really alarmed. But he has to get some political buy-in. And there are these 2 bills in Congress which are part of that, the 2 that I mentioned. Highlights include IMF and World Bank strangulation, and a demand that this is the sanctions on Ethiopia now, a demand that the sanctions will not be lifted unless Ethiopia completely capitulates to the U.S. militarily, unless it, quote, ceases all offensive military operations associated with the civil war and other conflicts in Ethiopia. In other words, if these sanctions will not be lifted unless the Ethiopian army just completely caves. And unless it, quote, allows independent investigators into the country to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. I'm sure you know that the international courts, like the ICC, and the ad hoc courts like the ICTR and the ICTY, are ways for the West to impose its will on these parts of the world it's trying to get control of. So both of the congressional bills include sweeping restrictions on speech, particularly on social media. H.R. 6600 makes way for the State Department to cooperate with the social media giants to stop the new axis of evil, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech about Ethiopia. This would be a violation of free speech, meaning freedom from government-controlled speech, S3199 threatens to censure and sanction anyone, anywhere in the world spreading misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech inside and outside Ethiopia and Eritrea, including the diasporas. And this would again, among many other things, be a violation of the free speech rights of any U.S. citizens who are part of the diaspora. So we need a network to try to stop the passage of these sanctions bills in Congress and to pressure Biden to lift the sanctions already in place. Now, there's one other sanctions bill I should mention. This has passed the House, but not the Senate. It's House Resolution 7311. It's the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. And this says, oh my God, that Russia might try to extract natural resources in Africa. Africans were hugely offended by this, and hopefully it will not pass in the Senate. This was passed after, at the UN, more African nations than nations from anywhere else in the world voted against, or either voted against or abstained in the resolution condemning Russia in the Ukraine. Now, one thing I didn't say about, I didn't talk about was, that's okay, that's a good one, let's just leave that one up there, that summarizes it. Yeah, wrapping up. Okay, so, one thing I didn't mention, or sanctions on Somalia, there's an arms embargo on Somalia. And that means that it cannot develop its own effective military, which it needs to control its coast and to fight terrorism in Al-Shabaab. There's a UN mission there, and the US is in there drone bombing and sent troops in there. And Europeans are also dumping their toxic waste all over the Somali coast, including even nuclear waste. And this is well documented. The UN Environment Program has even written about it. Nobody's going to do anything about it unless Somalia has its own sovereign, effective military. And that's not happening because of the arms embargo. So there, I'm done. Sorry if I went on too long.
Meeting have a similar question. First, I said talk about number 2. The U.S. sanctions and Western sanctions are unilateral. That means that they are basically affecting every part of the other country, society, economy. Most of what they're sanctioned are not, even when they're saying that it's a weapons, industrial complex, or bank, but majority are life-saving products. Some of them are water sanitation system. In Cuba, they even blocking the medical supplies and pencils and all these things, school buses. It happened before. So there's a difference. DBS is a grassroots organized to fight against the Israeli apartheid, and then also South African apartheid, specifically for countries, certain companies. There's a much difference, and they're not directly to aim to destroy other countries' people's lives. That is a very different, because the same thing happened right now in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The Western country and the U.S. sanction against Russia is a completely not only about what they're claiming, the military-industrial complex, but banking and also even culture. They've been sanctioning using anything that are related to Russian culture or heritage. So that is a very systematic effort. Then back to the question number 1. Not only U.S. is sanctioned, there's so many other countries, but most of the sanctions since the war, because sanctions are coming back for 200 years, it's not new things. Back old time, they also sanctioned against Haiti. U.S. sanctioned against Haiti after the independence, that threatened the U.S. dominance on the region. And different countries will sanction different countries provide throughout the World War II, World War One. So, same, but majority right now is coming from U.S. and Western countries, overwhelming majority.
Okay. Anyone else want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, the only legal sanctions are those imposed by the UN, meaning the UN Security Council, which isn't the most, it's at least, the UN Security Council at least represents a global balance of power. Recently, the European Union sanctioned a list of entities, 8 more entities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I'm sure people know is an ongoing tragedy. They didn't sanction Rwanda and Uganda, who are the aggressors in the Congo. But Dr. Denis Mukwege, you may know he's he's a gynecologist who treats women victims of sexual violence in the DRC and won the Nobel Prize, his enormous moral force. He came out this week and asked the UN to sanction Rwanda and Uganda. And those sanctions, he was asking for legal sanctions. What are illegal are unilateral sanctions imposed by the U.S. Or any other country, entity outside the UN Security Council. David?
An area of thought that sanctions that support imperialist agenda against the peoples of the world is something we should be against. But if there are sanctions that support the people that are being oppressed by the imperial agenda, that's okay. I mean, some people, and that's, to me, that's sort of parallels the kind of sentiment you were saying. And but as they were saying, most sanctions are unilateral by the United States. Most of the European countries that sanction just went along with the United States. And it's harming and killing thousands of people around the world and completely violating the sovereignty of other countries. And it's clear, it's unknown to most people in this country, but it's something we have to work on and make visible.
Oh, wait, hang on.
I might just say that I've become a fan of international law. The first principle of which is the sovereignty of nations.
There are a third of the world is right now under U.S. sanctions, but there's all sorts of pressure that U.S. imperialism puts on developing countries just in general in terms of where they spend that money that they get from the International Monetary Fund or how they spend the World Bank funds. And they're not called quote unquote sanctions, but their economy is being basically guided by the banks and the U.S. So how do you think that this sort of fits into the movement against the sanctions? And because they're struggling in the streets right now against austerity, against inflation and things like that. How does this fit into the fight against sanctions?
You know?
Yeah, also this is almost the same questions has been asking for last 5 speaking tours. So I think that is a good thing because of the concerns or maybe people want to know are very important because sanctions has not been discussed in this country. So many activists or people who concerns about this issue does not have a clear information, idea, or toolkits to how to fight against it. So I would say because I don't want to be the only person who has been traveled our country quite extensively for the last couple of years, and also I read for different medias. While there's a sanctions against U.S. and Western sanctions against those many 40 countries are so brutal, they also have the different countries always working on fight against or bypass the sanctions. And last couple of days that Chinese President Xi went to Saudi Arabia to meet with head of countries from around the Arab world to sign a multi-billion-dollar contract from scientific to gas to different area, even the space programs. And also, but also another thing is the de-dollarization, because one of the things sanction has been really used, have been cutting people using the dollars. The foreign, so-called, for us, between many countries, they call the hard currency, US dollars or euros. Because without those currency, in the history, you cannot buy products around the world. You cannot do international business and transactions. If you ban from the so-called SWIFT code, as the SWIFT, then you cannot do international financial transactions. So basically, seems like some kind of funny number, and then you probably, if you're in the US, you might don't see that it's that significant. But in international trade and business, that becomes your lifeline. And that is, most of the time, sanctions are mostly not a physical product, but more and more become a financial transactions or funny money. And that's how right now there's many countries against the US and Western sanction are de-dollarization and bypass US banking corporations. And that is one thing that most US and even progressive media are never talk about. And that's how one of the major discussion around the world right now.
Well, just one little thing to add. Not all sanctions are necessarily a written down law in the Treasury Department or the Office of Foreign Assets and the other U.S. agencies that have official sanctions that are, either by Congress or some department. It's just the chill effect. There are companies that won't insure a ship because they know it's going to Cuba or it might want to go to Cuba, or it's just the fear of possible sanctions. It's that threat of secondary and tertiary sanctions against companies, individuals, and countries. It's not written down, but it's that fear factor that keeps them from reaching out or trading or having relations with these targeted sanctioned countries. So there's, we know that there's maybe, I think it's 200 to 300, maybe 400 official sanctions on Venezuela. There's many more against Cuba, but there's many more than that areas of trade or relationships that have been blocked because of that fear of the U.S., the control of the international financial system that the U.S. still has, but hopefully is fading with the resistance that we see in many countries.
Do you want to?
I agree that it's happening, certainly in all over the
In
world.
Africa.
But it's there are Latin America, for example. There's been a lot of political revolutions and changes in governments, and looking at unifying and creating their own trade agreements, even their own currency. But there are setbacks also. There's looming coups in all these situations in societies that are very polarized, and such a legacy of U.S. intervention. Hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into right-wing groups to foment coups. And this is happening all over the world as well. So it is a trend that people have to, the U.S. empire never rests. And people have to be, you can celebrate the victories, but you have to be prepared fighting the sanctions, which is basically defending the sovereignty. And it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. The United Nations Charter is very simple. It's a very good framework to that many countries are referring back to. And sort of a side of it. It's so ironic and sad in a way that there was a group of countries, I think it was 14 or 15 countries, that formed a group, Friends to Defend the United Nations Charter.
Yeah, yeah.
And to have a group to defend, to announce to the larger group that we have to defend what we started. It's, you know, it's sad, but that's the state it's come to, where you have a country like the United States using its power to coerce to disregard all laws and agreements they've made and violate the sovereignty and coerce other countries to their will. And what the amazing thing is, is to me that the U.S. is demanding that all other countries follow U.S. laws. That's what Alex Saab is. Well, Alex Saab is a bigger, the trial against him is a bigger farce. But for the U.S., the arrogance of the U.S., which is basic to this ideology, that other countries should follow our laws, meaning we're the only ones that matter. And anyway, that's what I'll add to that.
When I said I was a fan of international law, that means most of all of the UN Charter. International law is defined in the UN Charter. First principle is the sovereignty of nations, and then there are multiple international treaties.
On the left, it's a particular thing to me maybe, but I usually don't like when they say people that sanctions aren't working. Sanctions, one of the goal for countries that defy our agenda, our neoliberal agenda, that want to develop their own path, one of the goals is regime change. That hasn't happened much. But the other goal is to destroy the economy, devastate the economy, make the people suffer. And I mean, look what they did to Libya, you know, and other countries. If they can't do regime change, we'll destroy your economy. And then it sends a message to the rest of the world. You defy us, this is what's happened to you. We may not kick out your president, but we'll destroy your economy.
So starving children leads to weakening the country so much that other countries take warning from
Well,
that.
they take a warning, and it also keeps that country from being a danger economically. It's not a good political example to follow. So in that sense, the sanctions do work because it's causing so much suffering around the world. So I think when people solely say, oh, the sanctions don't work, it kind of, it doesn't speak to what's really
Right,
happening.
exactly.
And it kind of makes people think, well, maybe sanctions aren't that bad if they're not working. What's the big complaint? Well, so we have to look at what they're actually doing and fight against it because of that.
I would answer with one very simple question is that's also the argument I hear many people in this country, even some of the right-wing community around the world, saying that any sanctions or any military invasion Western and U.S. countries has been imposed in suffering other countries are not the fault. This is called a collateral damage, not the fault of the U.S. So if sanctions when sanctions affect Syria, when sanctions affect Iraq during the Saddam Hussein period, then they said that 500,000 children died. That is not fault of the U.S. and Western sanctions.
Right.
That is a dictator's fault. That is right now the same thing, same argument in the Syria because what happened to the Syria sanctions and killing so many, and then also all these proxy war. They're not blaming the U.S. and Western countries. They keep saying that it's Assad's fault. Same thing back to 20 years ago on Iraq. They said that is Saddam's fault, not the Western countries' fault.
Oops. I wanted to take the prerogative of the chair just for a second. I don't want to stop any of this discussion, but it seems like we're talking about sanctioned countries, and Venezuela, which is right to the south of us, has been one of the countries most heavily sanctioned and most heavily penetrated by U.S. Big business interests. And we have Elaine here from the Alliance for Global Justice, who her organization is sponsoring a a whole event around the 10 years commemorating Chavez's legacy, a very long event, plus a trip to Venezuela. And Elaine, I was hoping you would talk about it just a little bit. And we have some flyers here. It's coming up in March. You want to come up and just replace? I'll move. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Elaine Spinac-Rodriguez with the Alliance for Global Justice. And well, I first just want to say thank you to all the panelists. This was an incredible event, and this resource is going to be important for a long time for activists and for the movement against sanctions. So to that note, we are
You have copies of the future.
yeah, I do. There are some copies. I brought some flyers announcing our delegation, which will be March 2nd through 12th. This flyer specifically focuses on the commemoration of the 10 years since Chavez's death, but really the main focus is looking at these sanctions and looking at the impact of these sanctions on different sectors in Venezuela, and then bringing that information back to the United States and working with our own government to change U.S. policy, to change some of these sanctions. I think what we're hearing from Venezuelans is that it is incredibly damaging in all areas, to infrastructure, to the medical system, to the educational system. And as we heard from all the panelists, what we need to do is have more conversations about sanctions. And so the more folks that we can get in Venezuela, the stronger our voice will be when we come back. And so we're asking folks to join us on this delegation. We imagine it can be a pretty big delegation, so we're prepared for quite a few people, but we're also willing to go with just a few. Thank you.
Okay, sure. And also the prerogative, I just want to mention, I think all the speakers have said that sanctions is an act of war. You can't really separate and say sanctions are sort of nice, they're a soft war, they don't hurt people as much as war. They're war, they're a form of war. And it was a big controversy, and it's been a big controversy in the U.S. anti-war movement for years. Whether or not, during the Iraq War, the whole question of sanctions came up, and part of the anti-war movement said, yeah, let's go for sanctions, then we won't have war. Well, the U.S. did both, and they will continue to do both. But I just put this up here because this is new. You'll hear about it. There are going to be a series of anti-war actions around Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. It's a national campaign. UNAC and the International Action Center, I think Code Pink is involved. A lot of people are involved in this, and hopefully we can get together and do some exciting demonstrations in the Bay Area to counter the sanctions and to counter, all of the wars, both at home, which we really haven't talked a lot about, and abroad. But I'm wondering if anybody want to say any more about the danger of sanctions and the importance of the anti-war movement taking a strong stance on that.
I think that I want to add one more thing on my book, which is the CHIPS Act and the relationship with Pelosi, because sanction is not only harming other people, other countries, but also is a big money opportunity for U.S. politicians and corporations and their kids and families. Everyone knows Nancy Pelosi has been a hardcore racist anti-China politician since 1990. I've been fighting since when I was in Pacifica Radio during the 90s. But I think almost no one probably in this room knows, which surprised me in many ways for the last 6 meetings. Probably no one knows, but Nancy Pelosi's husband, Mr. Pelosi, and her son, Pelosi Jr., has a big ass business in China,
Oh,
making big ass money for the last 30 years. And
Feinstein's husband too.
yes, and they has the investment. Her husband, Mr. Pelosi, has a very big working with a big investment firm based in Hong Kong and in mainland China, invest in billions of dollars in many high-tech companies and startups. Some of them are directly, indirectly sanctioned by the U.S.
wow.
And her son, Pelosi Jr., almost just like a Hunter Biden. Strangely enough, last week when I was in New York, I went to see the Hunter Biden's art show. It's pretty good, but they're different sort. Yeah, now he's become an artist. Yes. And so that's another story. But all these kids growing up with silver spoons have their own weird way to make money. Both like a Hunter and Junior, they both doesn't have official jobs. It's just only their parents arranging their business. So during the August, when Pelosi visited Taiwan and wanted to provoke the conflict with China, and Pelosi secretly brought her son as one of the delegation. However, her son, Junior, is not part of any official function. He just guests to go together, but not on the official list. U.S. media, every day when they report her trip, she is faced very clearly, but no one talk about it. And according to the media in Taiwan and mainland China, it was the purpose. Pelosi wanted to stir up attention, and then on the time when Biden signing the CHIPS Act, and they want to force the Asian semiconductor company to move their operation to U.S. One of them is the Taiwan Semiconductor Company. That's the biggest chip company in the world. And somehow during her trip in Taiwan, she arranged her son to meet with the CEO of this company. And just last week, Biden just announced this company will move everything, the factory, even down to the door, to move to Arizona to build a factory. The idea is to bring back the chip industry to U.S. And so that's all related. Most people don't believe that's going to work. If you're building this factory in the middle of the Silicon Valley, maybe a little bit, but middle of the nowhere in the Arizona, it's difficult to survive. And so that is just another big money opportunity, making opportunity is a corruption, and people did not know. So not only would then going back what we can do, I mean, if people, not necessarily outside the anti-war movement would care about this issue, but if that is affecting their bottom lines and their tax money, financial interest, we probably can make a case to drop more people. That could be one suggestion.
Well, just a couple related comments, but different. It makes me think of talking to people about sanctions, or the extent of sanctions. The one important thing that sustains the threat or backs up the threat is the 1,000 military bases we have around the world, and the trillions of dollars that go into that really kind of sustains the threat and fear of people to defy it, because sanctions, as I sort of alluded to before, it's one type of coercion. Like there's even one of the former CIA agents wrote a book and talked about, well, if we want to change a government, we can invade them, we can bribe the president, we can assassinate the leaders, we can strangle their economy. There's a whole range of things, and having military bases around every country to make connections with people here that's where our money's going. and we could be, using it for services here. I think that's important to bring up. And I try to talk to people too. They say, well, sanctions, you know what that are? And it always comes off as some kind of legal statute that somebody can't do this or that. But you say, okay, well, what if China or somebody, they put their warships outside New York Harbor, I live in New York, and decided to block medicines that your mother needs, or cancer drugs for your child that has cancer, can't have that anymore because China says you can't have it, and you only have water a few hours a week, which is most of Venezuela, or the electricity is off for 12, 16 hours at a time because we don't have the parts to fix the infrastructure because the U.S., because China says you can't do that. And most people say, well, that's ridiculous. We wouldn't tolerate that. That's crazy. That's wrong. Well, that's what we're doing to countries around the world. And so you have to get people here to see it from, if you were in their shoes, to see the illogic and immorality of it. Or I think it was alluded to, poor communities here, people making connections at the same kind of financial bank institutions, corporations that are plundering the economies of other countries are also doing it to poor communities in this country. And so really, it's still sort of a settler colony, this country, in a way, from and I think, it's hard to articulate maybe that to people, but we are being sanctioned in the sense that the austerity, the privatization that our government is trying to foist on other countries, they're doing it to our own communities. So it's sanctioning in a different sense of sanctioned. Restricting their freedoms, restricting what you can have. He says, no, we have to put the money into the war. We need austerity. So austerity itself to divert funds for people's needs for war is sort of a different form of sanction. And but I don't want to. That's what made me say that in the beginning. But I think the campaign of sanctions we're against is sanctions on entire populations of other countries. But whatever connections we can make to that and moving and raising the consciousness of the people here is important.
That's what we should stop saying. And sanctions are a form of war, which causes horrible suffering.
That's part of the purpose of the book and other people working on sanctions. It's to say it is a form of war. It is killing people. Some people say it's worse than war, bombs, and I never say that, but it's a form of war, and any people in social justice and anti-war movement should be against these sanctions. And they first have to understand them, and hopefully this book and your tour and other educational events and activities will help people see what sanctions do and the need to be against them, make people aware.
I talked about stopping genocide and mass atrocities as being the current dominant rationale of U.S. foreign policy, the excuse for aggression. But many sanctions, if you read the UN Convention on Genocide, many of the actions that the U.S. takes are in that convention. So you could argue that U.S. sanctions are genocidal, according to the UN Convention.